Centuries ago, a longship cut through a gray, unforgiving sea. Its prow, a snarling dragon, points toward a distant, unsuspecting shore. The men on board weathered, armed, and fiercely determined. These are the Vikings. We all think we know them, right? Bearded barbarians, axes raised, pillaging and plundering. But the real story of the Vikings is much more interesting. Today we were going to discover the truth behind these legendary seafarers. Our story doesn't begin with raids. It begins with fighting. The land they called home, Scandinavia, was harsh and unforgiving. Poor soil, short-growing seasons, and a rapidly growing population meant resources were scarce by the end of the 8th century. Around 793 AD, things were getting desperate. Imagine facing a future of hardship with little hope on the horizon. It is in this context that the Viking Age really takes root. Driven by necessity but fueled by a thirst for something more, the first recorded Viking raid on the monastery of Lindisfarne on the coast of England was a shockwave. For centuries, Europe had considered itself relatively safe, protected by its walled cities and Christian faith. Then came these fearsome figures from the north, sailing in what looked like magical ships, their axes falling like thunder. But this was no random act of violence. Lindisfarne was a wealthy, largely defenseless monastery with access to riches. The Vikings were not mindless brutes. They were pragmatists. They sought resources, silver, gold, slaves, things that their homelands simply could not provide. But the narrative of sheer wanton violence only tells part of the story. The raids, while brutal, were just the beginning of a complex evolution. Think of them as the opening act, leading up to a much larger symphony. As the initial shock wore off, the Vikings became less interested in quick raids and more interested in establishing a presence. They were incredible shipbuilders. Their longships, masterpieces of engineering and design, perfectly suited to riding shallow rivers and sailing the open seas. These ships were not just weapons of war. They were tools for exploration, trade, connection. The Viking longship is one of the most important elements of their history. Without these vessels, there might never have been a Viking Age. They went beyond simply taking what they wanted. They became skilled traders, establishing extensive networks that stretched from the British Isles to Constantinople, what is now Istanbul, and even further east. They were trading furs, amber, slaves, and walrus ivory for silver, spices, silks, and wine. They were becoming a trading force to be reckoned with. Let's talk about their culture, the things that made them who they were. The Vikings were not a monolithic, homogeneous group. They were farmers, craftsmen, artists, poets, and storytellers. Their mythology of gods, giants, and fantastical creatures offered a way to make sense of their harsh world. We have the stories of Odin, the wise one-eyed chief god, Thor with his mighty hammer, and Loki, the god of mischief and trickery. Their jewelry, their wood and metal carvings also tell us stories. They show the artistic sensibility that underpinned their lives. And the runes, those mysterious symbols, were not just a form of writing. They were believed to contain magical power. Viking culture was a complex mix of practicality and spirituality. But the story does not end with trade and plunder. Perhaps one of the most fascinating aspects of the Viking Age is their exploration. They were not confined to Europe alone. They pushed the boundaries of the known world. They established settlements in Iceland, Greenland, and even reached the shores of North America. Centuries before Columbus, imagine their courage, the sheer audacity of sailing into the unknown in wooden ships, guided by the stars, and a powerful sense of curiosity. These expeditions were far from guaranteed success. They were incredibly risky journeys into unknown territory. That is what set them apart. It is not just their battles that defined them, but also their thirst for knowledge. They were not simply about conquest. they were also about discovery. Life in these new settlements was difficult. Iceland, for example, was an island of volcanoes and glaciers, far from the fertile lands of Scandinavia. They had to adapt, and they did. They became skilled farmers, fishermen, and shipbuilders in this new environment. They also established their own political systems. Some of the oldest known democratic systems we have seen, Greenland and Vinland, the Viking name for North America, presented even greater challenges. These outposts were much more remote and isolated. The settlement in Vinland did not last, probably due to a combination of conflicts with indigenous peoples and the harsh environment. But the fact that they even got there says a lot about their resilience and determination. The Viking Age, as we understand it, did not last forever. By the 11th century, things were changing. The spread of Christianity across Scandinavia, the rise of centralized kingdoms, and a shift in political power across Europe all contributed to the decline of Viking raiding. These Vikings became Christians, and their Norse religion died out. The Viking ethos of exploration did not disappear, but it was transformed. They integrated into the societies they had once raided. Warriors became farmers, traders, and eventually simply Europeans, no different from anyone else. There was no single moment, no final battle that ended the Viking Age. It was a gradual change, a merging of cultures. It is important to recognize that the Vikings never completely disappeared. Instead, their heritage is still a part of us and the world around us.